Sign it. You don't really have anything to lose anyway. That was what my wife said right in the middle of my retirement party, while my son clapped his hands and my daughter laughed as if she were watching a form of entertainment. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. I stood there holding the divorce papers, hearing every beat of my own heart. No one in that room knew that. This was not the first time in my life I had held documents about dividing assets. I signed my name. No arguing, no resistance. But right after that, I quietly opened the leather briefcase I had carried with me throughout the party, took out another stack of documents, and placed it on the table in front of everyone. I didn't say a word, and it was that very moment of silence that made the entire room begin to panic. If you're listening to this story, leave me a comment and let me know where you're listening from. A like or a subscription can help this story reach many others who are quietly enduring what I once did. That party was supposed to be a moment of honor for me. 69 years old, 41 years working for the city. I had been counting down the days to hang my hard hat on the hook, fold up my worn gloves, and say goodbye to freezing mornings and rain-soaked night shifts. The county community hall was packed. Former co-workers, neighbors, and a few distant relatives I only ever saw at funerals or Christmas. A banner hung on the wall in bold letters. Happy retirement, Robert, with an image of a clock whose hands had stopped. I looked at it all evening, feeling both proud and strangely light, as if I could finally breathe. Linda, my wife, was the one who organized everything. She called everyone herself, chose the cake, hired a band to play old songs from the 80s. She moved back and forth across the hall with her practiced smile, the one I had learned to understand over the years. Polite, proper, but with no room for me inside it. Evan, my son, stood near the drinks table, talking to a few friends in a lowered voice, as if trying to keep his distance from the atmosphere of the party. Natalie, my daughter, wore a neatly tailored black dress, her eyes fixed on her phone, occasionally looking up to smile politely, before lowering her gaze again. When my former supervisor stepped up to speak, I felt warmth spread through my chest. He talked about long shifts, about snowstorms that left entire neighborhoods dark, and about people like me who went out into the night to restore power line by line. There was applause, a few whistles. I stood up, nodded in thanks, and saw genuine respect in the eyes of some people. In that moment, I thought, whatever my family thinks, at least these people understand what I've done for this city. Then Linda stepped up. She held the microphone with both hands as if afraid it might slip. Her voice was soft and composed. She talked about the years I left early for work, the nights I came home late, the hardships of a husband who had devoted his entire life to his job. She spoke in the past tense, and I realized what was coming. Even before she took the stack of papers out of her handbag, the air in the room shifted. I heard chairs move, short whispers, and then that sentence fell clean and cold, like a knife placed exactly where it would cut deepest. Sign it. You don't really have anything to lose. Anyway, Evan clapped first. I don't know whether he did it out of shock or because he had been prepared. Natalie laughed, a short laugh, as if she could finally exhale. No one stood up to stop it. No one said, wait. I looked at the familiar faces and understood something. This decision hadn't been made overnight. It had been rehearsed, discussed, approved. I was the last to know. I held the papers, thick pages, fresh ink, lines of dry legal language stretched on, talking about assets, obligations, a shared life being cut in half. My hand didn't shake, maybe because in that moment some part of me had already shut down. I signed my name, Robert Hayes, in my usual handwriting, neither rushed nor slow. I heard a few sighs of relief. I saw Linda tilt her head slightly, as if she had gotten exactly what she was waiting for. Then I opened the leather briefcase, the same briefcase I had carried for years, worn at the corners, the zipper slightly stiff. I placed the other folder on the table, thicker, heavier. I didn't say anything. I let the silence do its work. The people closest to the table began glancing at one another. Linda looked at the folder, then at me. Evan frowned. Natalie finally looked up from her phone. No one asked a question, and because no one asked, I knew I had chosen the right moment. The truth was, for many years, I had grown used to not being asked. No one asked how my workdays were. No one asked how I managed when tuition payments were due. No one asked why I never complained about money. They were used to thinking I was simple, that I just worked and came home, that my life was a straight line with no turns. And I let them think that. But standing in that hall with the music cut off and the lights shining directly on the table, I realized I no longer wanted to play that role. Not out of anger, not for revenge, but because my silence had finally finished doing its job. I looked around the room. Faces that smiled at me when they needed help fixing something. Faces that looked away when I walked into my own family's gatherings. I thought of evenings alone in the garage. The smell of oil and grease. The old radio playing the news. I thought of the times I chose overtime instead of coming home. Not because I loved work more than my family, but because there, at least I was judged by what I could actually do. Linda cleared her throat, breaking the silence. She asked if I was okay. I nodded. I said I was fine. My voice sounded so normal that even I was surprised. In my mind, the pieces were coming together with perfect clarity. This party, this timing, Evan's reaction, Natalie's reaction, none of it was random. I realized that the dismissive comments from the past, Linda calling me settled, Evan saying I just worked for the city, Natalie avoiding answers when friends asked about me, all of it had led to this moment. They had built a story about me, and tonight, they were simply ending it with a public ritual. I didn't stand up to give a speech. I didn't take the microphone. I just looked at the folder in front of me, then at Linda. She didn't know what was inside, and that not knowing made her uneasy. I saw it in the way she tightened her grip on her purse strap, in the way she avoided meeting my eyes. Evan leaned toward his mother and whispered something. Natalie set her phone down on the table for the first time that evening. I folded the divorce papers carefully and placed them on top of the other folder. A small gesture, but enough to make a few people in the room hold their breath. I could feel curiosity spreading like a ripple. I knew they wanted me to speak. I knew they wanted an explosion, but I had learned that speaking more doesn't always carry more weight. When the music was awkwardly turned back on, I picked up my briefcase, closed the zipper, and said I needed to step outside for some air. No one stopped me. No one followed. I walked out of the hall and stood under the yellow lights of the parking lot, taking a deep breath. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of wet grass and car exhaust. I felt my heartbeat slow. In that moment, I knew the first part of the story was over. They had done what they wanted to do, and I had set the bait in the water. The folder was still there on the table like an unanswered question, and I knew that from this moment on. None of them could pretend I was just a man who had nothing to lose. I stood in the parking lot a few minutes longer before going back inside, but my story had already begun turning back long before that. Before the party, before the divorce papers, before the applause that sent a chill through me. It started with the way my family saw me, not in a single moment, but over years, through glances, through words that seemed harmless. In Linda's eyes, I was a stable man. She often used that word when talking about me to others. Not respected, not dedicated, but stable. Stable like an old chair in the living room. Always there. Not troublesome, but not impressive either. Whenever guests came over, Linda introduced me quickly, as if afraid someone might ask more. This is Robert, my husband. He works for the city. That was it. No title, no story, just works for the city, as if I sat somewhere behind a dusty desk. I corrected her once, very gently. I said I worked in infrastructure maintenance, overseeing water systems and underground electrical lines on the east side. Linda smiled, placed her hand on my arm, and said, "That's what I meant." That sentence ended every attempt at explanation. After that, I let her speak the way she wanted. Evan studied law at a fairly good school. I was proud of him, even though I rarely said it out loud. Whenever I visited, I tried to dress neatly, not out of shame, but because I didn't want to embarrass him. I noticed Evan rarely introduced me to his friends. When someone asked, he would say quickly, "Dad works in city maintenance," and then immediately change the subject to internships, mock trials, or a difficult professor. I heard it a few times, standing a few steps away, pretending to look at my phone. Each time I felt myself shrink a little. Natalie was different. She didn't avoid me. She concealed me. When friends came over, she quietly moved me out of the picture. If someone asked about her family, she talked about her mother first, about her mother's job, her trips, her plans. And me, if I was mentioned at all, I was a footnote at the bottom of the page. Dad. Oh, he's around. I knew exactly what that answer meant. It meant I wasn't something she wanted to carry with her into the world. Family gatherings slowly became tests. I stood on the edge of conversations, holding a glass of water, listening to people talk about stocks, real estate, things they called success. When I told a story about work, a night shift during a snowstorm, or a time I helped prevent an entire neighborhood from losing power, no one asked a follow-up question. Linda would step in and change the subject. Evan checked his watch. Natalie smiled politely. I learned to end my stories earlier each time. The feeling of being diminished didn't arrive all at once. It came gradually, like water seeping through a small crack. At first, I thought I was being overly sensitive. I told myself this was normal as you get older, as your children grow up and form their own worlds. I told myself not to expect too much, but eventually, I had to face a harder truth. They didn't just see me as outdated, they saw me as lesser. Linda often talked about my unused potential. She said I was smart, that I could have done more if I hadn't chosen a safe path. I didn't argue. I knew if I said that this safe path had supported the entire family, the conversation would turn into an argument. And I hated arguments. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew I would end up saying things no one wanted to hear. Some nights after everyone was asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, with only the small light over the sink on. I thought about the years that had passed, about the choices I'd made. I wondered if I was wrong to choose a quieter life. But then I remembered the times Evan needed application fees, the times Natalie needed a guarantor. They came to me when they needed certainty, and I was always there. That meant something, even if they didn't want to admit it. Gradually, I stopped reacting. When Linda made a sarcastic comment, I nodded. When Evan grew impatient, I listened. When Natalie avoided my eyes, I didn't try to pull her back. I shifted from reacting to observing. I began noticing how they spoke when they thought I wasn't listening. I remembered small details. The looks exchanged between Linda and Evan, the way Natalie fell silent whenever money came up. I didn't jump to conclusions. I just collected information. My silence made them comfortable. They thought I didn't notice. They thought I was used to being overlooked. And in a way, they were right. I was used to it, but not in the way they assumed. I was used to standing back and seeing the full picture. I was used to waiting. I understood that in many of life's games, the winner isn't the one who talks the most, but the one who knows when to keep his cards in his hand. One evening during dinner, Linda told a joke about me not knowing how to use new phone apps. Evan laughed out loud. Natalie shook her head as if in pity. I laughed, too. But in my mind, something else was taking shape. I realized my silence was no longer just a habit. It had become a choice. And every time I chose silence, I was preparing for something they couldn't see. I didn't know then what lay ahead. I only knew that, if I kept reacting the old way, explaining, justifying, trying to be understood, I would stay stuck in the same circle. And I was tired of that circle. So I chose a different path. The path of observation, of patience, of letting others reveal their true thoughts. Silence wasn't weakness. I understood that more clearly than ever. It was the necessary distance to see who was really standing in front of me. And during those years, as my family grew accustomed to the image of a father who was nothing to be proud of, I was learning how to become a man who didn't need their approval to know his worth. I don't remember exactly when Evan first asked to borrow money. I only remember his tone, calm, almost gracious, as if he were giving me a chance to be useful. It was an early autumn afternoon. I was in the garage fixing a lawnmower that had been rattling for weeks. My phone vibrated. Evan was calling. Dad, I need some money for next semester's tuition, he said directly. Not a lot, just a few thousand for fees, books, little things. I asked how much. He hesitated, as if afraid the number might scare me. I listened and nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I asked when he needed it. He said as soon as possible. There was no apology for bothering me. No question about whether I could manage it. Just one closing line. I know you'll understand. I understood. I always did. I hung up, washed my hands, and went upstairs to my small home office. Third drawer on the left. I took out my checkbook. I wrote the check, signed it, and put it in an envelope. When Evan came to pick it up, he took the envelope with one hand, nodded his thanks, and said, "It really helps that you handle this. I know you're not exactly rolling in money." That sentence stayed with me all evening, not because it was cruel, but because it was unconscious. Evan truly believed I wasn't well off, and I realized then that wasn't just his fault. A few months later, it was Natalie's turn. She called early in the morning, her voice quieter and more careful than Evan's. She said she had applied for a loan for a small startup project, but the bank required a guarantor. She explained she had asked her mother, but Linda said it wasn't appropriate. She asked her uncle, then a family friend. No one agreed. I was the last person she called. "Dad, I hate to ask," Natalie said, "but could you sign as a guarantor? It's just paperwork." I asked why the bank needed one. Natalie explained the risk, the credit history. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said I'd look at the documents. That afternoon, she brought them over. I signed. No questions, no comments about being the last option. Natalie sighed with relief, smiled, and said, "I didn't think you'd qualify, but apparently they accepted it." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Neither Evan nor Natalie had ever asked where my money came from. They never asked about my income. They never asked if I had savings. They simply assumed I could scrape together enough to rescue them when needed, but not enough to be considered successful. I paid, I signed, I guaranteed, and I remembered, not with resentment, but with clarity. I remembered every word, every look, every unconscious shrug. I began to understand that in their eyes, my value didn't lie in who I was as a person, but in my usefulness when required. Linda reinforced that image quietly. Whenever money came up, she spoke for me. Robert doesn't need much, she often told others. He's very simple. A stable job is enough for him. It sounded like praise, but underneath was a clear message. I wasn't ambitious. I wasn't a wealth creator, just someone who kept things from falling apart. Once at a dinner with Natalie's friends, someone asked me about my work. I had just opened my mouth when Linda answered for me. He does maintenance for the city, she said, then turned back to the other person and continued another conversation. I sat there chewing slowly, feeling like a familiar piece of furniture, present but not worth noticing. Moments like that accumulated quietly, without drama, just a persistent sense that I was being used in a very polite way. I was the one who paid bills, signed papers, absorbed risk, but when it came to pride, to status, to showing off to others, I didn't exist. I remember clearly the moment I understood this fully. It was late one evening. I was sitting alone in the living room, the TV on but muted. Linda was in the kitchen talking on the phone with her sister. I wasn't eavesdropping, but her voice carried. She complained that I only wanted a quiet life, that I didn't understand the pressure to move up. She called me settled and said it like a judgment. I turned off the TV. I sat still. I listened, not to argue, but to understand. And in that moment, I saw a blunt truth. They didn't need me as a human being. They needed me as a resource, something to draw from when necessary and ignore when not. The seed of resistance didn't sprout immediately. It was planted deep in the silence I had chosen long ago. I didn't explode. I didn't confront anyone. I simply changed the way I looked at things. I stopped thinking about how to earn their approval. I started thinking about how to protect myself. From then on, whenever Evan called for money, I still helped, but I listened more closely to his tone. Whenever Natalie needed my signature, I signed, but I read every clause more carefully. I didn't reveal my thoughts. I let them keep believing I was a content, unambitious father with nothing beyond stability. But inside, I was different. I was no longer naive enough to believe that sacrifice automatically earns respect. I understood that in some relationships, if you don't set boundaries, you become nothing more than a wallet with legs. And I had accepted that role for far too long. I didn't know then how I would push back or when. I only knew that from the moment I realized I was valued only for money when they needed it. I stopped seeing my silence as endurance. It became preparation, and that seed, small as it was, had begun to take root. After that night, once the seed of resistance had taken hold, I didn't change the outward shape of my life. I still woke up early, still drank coffee from the chipped ceramic mug, still drove my old pickup out of the driveway, while the morning was still gray with fog. If anything was different, it was only that my breathing had grown steadier. I no longer felt impatient when I was overlooked. I began to understand that whatever extra work I did, if I did it long enough and quietly enough, would become something no one could take away from me. Extra shifts came to me like a habit. When coworkers turned them down because they had weekend plans, I took them. When there was a nighttime emergency, I signed up. No one forced me. I volunteered. I worked while others slept. When the streets were empty, when yellow streetlights reflected off wet pavement, I grew used to the smell of metal engine oil, the steady whistle of wind through narrow gaps. In moments like that, my mind felt clear. No one judged me by a title. There was only the work to be done, and the result that had to be achieved. During the day, when I came home, I didn't say much. Linda was used to me getting back late. She took it as a given for a man with no other ambitions. I let her think that. After dinner, when everyone went upstairs, I opened my old computer in the small home office. I wasn't looking for big dreams. I was looking for numbers. I read about real estate, about cash flow, about neighborhoods that were overlooked when the economy wobbled. I learned to look at maps differently, not at the main roads, but at the corners where value was underestimated. The first nights I read slowly. My eyes were tired. My hands sore from working all day, but I kept at it. On weekends, when Evan came home briefly and then left again, when Natalie shut her bedroom door to talk on the phone, I sat at the kitchen table with printed pages underlining key sections. I learned how to calculate repair costs, how to read market reports, how to tell the difference between advertising and reality. No one knew what I was doing, and I liked it that way. The opportunity came right when the market was shaken. Many people were afraid and selling fast. I was the opposite. I saw small houses being abandoned, priced below their real value. The first one I bought was in an old neighborhood where weeds grew taller than my knees. The house was low with a dark roof and dusty windows. I remember standing in front of it, hands in my coat pockets, feeling cold air slip down my collar. I didn't see decay. I saw potential. I used savings no one paid attention to. Not a large amount, but enough. The paperwork was signed on a gray afternoon. No ceremony, no congratulations. I drove home, stopped in the garage, and sat still for a few minutes before going inside. Linda asked where I had been. I said I'd taken extra work. She nodded. The conversation ended there. The weeks that followed were a stretch of fixing things myself. I replaced light fixtures, patched the roof, painted walls. I worked evenings and weekends carrying my familiar toolbox. My hands were used to wrenches and hammers, so fixing a house didn't scare me. I learned patience with old things. I listened to the creak of wood, the sound of water and pipes, as if the house were telling me its story. When everything was ready, I listed it for rent. I didn't expect much, just enough to cover costs. On the day the first tenants moved in, I stood on the sidewalk watching them unload boxes. They were a young couple with a few cardboard cartons and a potted plant. They smiled at me and thanked me for fixing the kitchen. For the first time in a long while, I felt appreciation coming from somewhere unfamiliar. The first cash flow arrived quietly. No chimes, no fireworks, just a deposit into a separate account I had opened earlier. I stared at the number for a long time, not because it was big, but because it represented something new. An income that didn't depend on recognition from anyone in my family. I didn't tell Linda. I didn't tell Evan or Natalie. I knew if I did, the story would change. The money would be calculated for other needs, and I didn't want that. I decided to keep it secret, not to deceive, but to protect. I understood how money worked in my family. It never stayed where it was created. It flowed to wherever the loudest voice was, and I didn't want my effort to dissolve into conversations where I had no place. From the first house I continued. Not rushed, not flashy. I bought when I could, fixed what was needed, rented when it was ready. I kept everything in the dark, the way you shield a small flame from the wind. Each time I came home after a repair job, clothes speckled with paint, hands aching, Linda would look at me and shake her head. "You should rest more," she said. I smiled. Rest to me was knowing I was building something solid. The shifts no one knew about kept going. I took extra work whenever possible, saving bit by bit. I didn't brag. I didn't look for praise. I just worked. My mindset was clear. Build in the dark so the light doesn't blind you. I let my family keep seeing me as a content man with no ambition. And in that quiet, I laid each brick for a foundation they had no idea existed. Some nights, sitting alone, I thought about what I was doing. I didn't see it as revenge. I saw it as finally paying attention to myself. I no longer needed to prove anything to Linda, to Evan, to Natalie. I understood the value of quiet work, and I believed that one day that quiet would speak without me having to say a word. The first house didn't change my life overnight. It didn't make me rich, didn't bring any clear sense of victory, but it did something more important. It taught me rhythm, the rhythm of patience, the rhythm of building little by little in silence without applause. After the first year, I bought a second house, then a third. There was never a year I bought too many, and some years I bought none at all. I only bought when everything truly made sense. I learned to say no to opportunities that sounded attractive but carried risk. I didn't chase rumors or follow others. I only did what I understood and could control. Everything was in my name. I opened a separate account, kept clear records, organized all paperwork, not because I was afraid someone would find out, but because I knew, if one day everything came under scrutiny, I would need absolute clarity. Ironically, no one in my family bothered to look. They didn't care. And that indifference became the perfect camouflage. Linda still saw me as a simple man. When I came home late from repairs, she thought I was just doing odd jobs for the city. When I was tired, she told me I should rest more, as if I were wearing myself down because I didn't know how to enjoy life. I nodded and smiled, letting her keep thinking that. Evan and Natalie didn't ask either. They were used to the image of a father who worked steadily, dreamed little, and had nothing worth telling. Meanwhile, my passive income began to surpass my main salary. At first, it was only a small difference. Then gradually the numbers became clearer. I didn't celebrate. I didn't change how I lived. I still drove the old truck, still wore the same jacket. I knew that if I changed, questions would come, and I didn't want those questions. The funny thing was, my calm was misunderstood. Linda said I wasn't stressed because there was nothing to worry about. Evan assumed I felt no pressure because I had no big ambitions. Natalie looked at me like someone who had accepted being out of the race early. They didn't know I wasn't stressed because I was prepared. I wasn't worried because I had built a foundation stronger than they imagined. Sarcasm slowly became a habit in the house. Jokes that sounded harmless but repeated often enough. They weren't. Linda would tell others, I only needed a chair and a TV. Evan laughed along. Natalie shook her head. I laughed, too. Not because I agreed, but because I knew each comment was making me safer. The more I was underestimated, the less attention I drew. The less attention I drew, the freer I became. I could go look at houses without explaining myself. I could spend weekends fixing things without questions. I could learn, calculate, and decide without pressure from family expectations. Being underestimated in a strange way became my ally. Some evenings, sitting alone in my office, I looked at the list of my properties and saw the growth year by year. Not to brag, but to remind myself that what I was doing was real. I thought about the times Evan called me settled, the times Natalie avoided mentioning me to friends. I didn't feel angry. I felt grateful. If they had understood what I was doing, I might not have gotten this far. I began preparing for a day I didn't yet know would come. Not a day of revenge, but a day when the truth would have to surface. I organized documents, updated records, made sure everything was clear. I didn't tell anyone, not even close friends. I kept my circle very small, just me and the numbers. In the family, everything went on, as usual. Quiet dinners, shallow conversations. Linda sometimes sighed, saying she wanted more from life. Evan talked about the future, about not wanting to get stuck. Natalie talked about image, about building a personal brand. No one asked what I thought, and I didn't volunteer it. I understood they had built an image of me over too many years for it to change easily. In that image, I was the man on the sidelines, with no influence, no say, and I let them keep believing it. Because each passing year, my small empire grew stronger, wider, more discreet. At times, I wondered if I was living two lives, one in front of my family, where I was an ordinary, even mediocre father, and another, where I was the decision-maker, the one responsible, the one in control. Then I realized it was only one life seen from two different angles, and I chose to keep the second angle to myself. Looking back, one thing became clear. If I had been respected more, I might not have had the space to build. If I had been praised, I might have softened, shared more, scattered my resources. Being underestimated, painful as it was, gave me ideal conditions to prepare. I didn't know how the day they exposed themselves would unfold. I didn't plan a dramatic moment. I only knew that when that day came, I wouldn't panic. I wouldn't rush. I would simply open what I had prepared and let the truth speak for itself. My empire wasn't built on loud ambition. It was built on years of being overlooked, on shifts no one knew about, on patience that only the underestimated can have. And as I placed the final bricks for this stage, I understood that my greatest safety lay in the fact that they still believed. I had nothing of significance. Linda's change didn't come loudly. It didn't look like the stories people usually tell. Big arguments, sleepless nights, accusations. It came quietly in small details that anyone untrained to observe would miss. But I was used to seeing what others didn't. First was her appearance. Linda began paying attention to her clothes in a different way. Not the familiar outfits she wore to school meetings or neighborhood gatherings, but pieces chosen more carefully, more fitted, more intentional. She changed her hairstyle, changed her perfume. Some mornings I came into the kitchen and caught a scent I didn't recognize, one she hadn't used for years. I didn't ask. I just noted it. Then there was her schedule. Linda started coming home later. Meeting friends, working out, running errands appeared more often during the week. Some days she left early, saying she had places to stop by, but didn't return until evening. Before she always texted if she'd be late. Now she didn't. I didn't ask why. I just watched the clock, watched dinner cool on the table, and told myself every change has a reason. Her phone became inseparable from her. Linda carried it into the kitchen, into the yard when she watered plants. Before she left it on the table, screen, up or down, it didn't matter. Now it was always face down. When messages came in, she glanced quickly and put it away. Once I walked into the living room while she was on a call. She stopped mid-sentence, hung up, and said it was just her sister checking in. I nodded. Nothing more. Unusual expenses began appearing on the statements. I didn't check often, but I still glanced when needed. The amounts weren't large, but they were regular. Meals at places Linda rarely went. Services I didn't remember her using. I didn't confront her. I knew if I asked too soon, I'd only get an answer designed to end the conversation, not reveal the truth. What caught my attention most was how Linda talked about the future. It was no longer we, but slowly became each of us. She talked about wanting to change living spaces, about wanting things lighter. She talked about not clinging too tightly to old things. Each sentence alone sounded harmless. Together, they formed a picture clearer than I wanted to see. I didn't confront her, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that confronting too early only makes things better hidden. I chose another way. I gathered information the way I always had, quietly, patiently, without letting on that I was watching. I let Linda keep believing I didn't notice. I let her believe her changes caused no ripples. I paid attention to how Evan and Natalie spoke with Linda. Short calls, exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't watching. Evan began asking Linda more about plans. Natalie grew quieter when I was around. No one said anything directly, but their unspoken agreement became clearer. I didn't need to hear words to understand they had talked. One evening at dinner, Linda said we should think about each person's future. Evan nodded. Natalie didn't object. I chewed slowly, swallowed, and asked a very ordinary question. What do you mean? Linda answered vaguely, saying the kids would eventually move on, that everyone needed space. I nodded as if I agreed, but in my mind, everything had begun to line up. I realized they weren't just thinking about leaving me. They were preparing to divide things, not through arguments, but through assumptions. The assumption that what I had was little. The assumption that dividing it would be simple. The assumption that I wouldn't resist. Those assumptions made them confident, and that confidence made them careless. I began reviewing everything I had built, not because I feared losing it, but to be sure. I went through documents, accounts, contracts. I made sure everything was solid. I didn't change anything suddenly. I didn't move money. I didn't do anything that would raise suspicion. I simply prepared as I always had. Some nights lying beside Linda, I listened to her breathing change when her phone vibrated in the dark. She turned away from me, reading messages in the shadows. I stared at the ceiling, not angry, not broken the way people imagine. I felt a cold calm, not because I no longer cared, but because I had gone too far down the path of observation to return to blindness. I knew I was standing at a crossroads. One path was confrontation, putting everything on the table, demanding explanations. The other was waiting, letting them reveal everything they believed I couldn't see. I chose the second, not because it was easier, but because it was fair. Fair to me, fair to the years I had spent silent. When Linda talked about organizing a retirement party for me, I nodded. I let her take charge. I let Evan and Natalie be involved. I let them believe I was entering the final stage of a simple life. Meanwhile, I knew very clearly the time was approaching. Not the time to speak, but the time to let them speak for themselves. I didn't know exactly when they would act, but I knew one thing for certain. When they did, they would believe I had nothing to lose, and that belief would be their greatest mistake. I began hearing the phrase "mom's happiness" more often in family conversations, like a mantra repeated until it became truth. Evan said it one afternoon when he stopped by, leaning against the kitchen counter with a glass of water in his hand. His tone was gentle, measured, as if stating something obvious. He said Mom had sacrificed many years, that now was the time for her to think about herself. Natalie added softer lines that everyone had the right to find their own path, that sometimes loving someone meant letting go. I listened, nodded, set my coffee cup down, and didn't argue. They didn't mention me, not directly, but the absence of my name in those sentences was exactly what caught my attention. I was like a piece removed from the picture so the rest could be rearranged more neatly. Linda stayed silent during those moments, eyes on the table, neither confirming nor denying. Her silence felt like agreement without a signature. Then the suggestions began. Not orders, but questions that sounded casual. Evan asked if I'd ever thought about selling the house. Natalie said the market was good, that many people were selling to free up capital. Linda said the house was too big for two people, that maybe we should think about something smaller and more convenient. I listened, asked a few questions to keep the conversation going, then let it drift away. In my mind, the pieces continued to fit together. They talked about dividing assets the way people talk about rearranging furniture. No one used the word loss. They used reasonable. They talked about fairness, about everyone having a share. I realized their way of speaking assumed the outcome. Divorce was no longer a possibility. It had become inevitable. A next step in a plan they believed I would accept the way I had accepted so many things before. Large loans began appearing one after another, as if a door that had once been hesitated over was now fully open. Evan asked me about money for additional tuition larger than before. Natalie mentioned needing capital to expand her project, calling it an opportunity you can't miss. They spoke with the same familiar tone, part expectation, part assumption. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I wanted to. They only asked when I began to understand something cold and clear. In their minds, that money had belonged to them for a long time, not on paper, but in thought. They had already spent what had never been theirs. They had planned based on the assumption that everything would be divided, that I would sign them way I was signed, that I wouldn't make things difficult. That confidence made them reckless. And that recklessness gave me my final answer. One evening, while we were all sitting down to eat, Natalie talked about restructuring the family finances. Evan nodded and added that the law always aims for fairness. Linda set her fork and knife down, sighed, and said she was tired of waiting. I looked at each of them, at the way they traded glances, at how they avoided looking me in the eye when they said the important things, and in that moment, I knew they had chosen a side. Not today, not yesterday, a long time ago. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the table. I didn't ask why. I just finished my portion, stood up, and did the dishes. In my mind, a decision had already been made, as clean as shutting a door. Not the decision to confront them, but the decision to hit back in my way, in a way they wouldn't expect. I stopped explaining. I stopped hoping they would understand. I moved all my energy into preparation. I went back through every document, every contract. I updated my lists and reorganized the files into a clear order. I checked my separate accounts, making sure everything was fully separated. I didn't do anything in a rush. I didn't change my routine. I let everything carry on as normal because normal was the best cover. Linda talked about throwing a retirement party for me. She said it was something I deserved after so many years of work. Evan acted excited and said he'd invite a few people he knew. Natalie offered to handle the decorations. I looked at them, smiled, and said that if everyone wanted to, I didn't mind. In my head, a thought began to form slowly. That party wouldn't just be a goodbye to my job. It would be a stage. Not a stage for an argument. Not a place where I'd let my anger spill out, but a place where every assumption would be dragged into the light. A place where they believed I'd be at my weakest, most vulnerable, and therefore easiest to control. I knew they would choose that moment to act because it was symbolic. A man retiring, stepping into the ending of his life the way they saw it. A man like that in their minds wouldn't have many options, so I let them prepare. I let them make the guest list. I let Linda pick the cake and the music. I let Evan and Natalie talk through what they would say. I didn't ask. I didn't interfere. I only watched. Every call, every text, every little meeting, in the living room when I wasn't there, it all strengthened my decision. Some nights I sat alone looking out at the backyard where the light spilled across neatly trimmed bushes. I thought about how I had ended up here, not through hatred, but through clarity. I didn't see myself as a victim. I saw myself as someone who had let things go on long enough for their true nature to show. I thought back to the years of being underestimated, the sarcastic comments, the eyes that looked away. I realized that if I'd reacted sooner, maybe things would have been different. But maybe I also wouldn't have had enough information to stand firm. Now it was different. I didn't need to argue about feelings. I only needed the truth. The retirement party slowly became the main topic in the house. Linda talked about the guest list like it was an important project. Evan asked if I wanted to invite anyone else. Natalie talked about picking colors for the decorations. I nodded and told them to decide. I didn't need much, and that was true. I didn't need much for myself, but I needed the right timing. Deep down, I knew what they were expecting from me. A signature, a nod, acceptance. And because they expected that, they didn't prepare for any other possibility. They didn't think I would question anything. They didn't think I was ready. They believed I was still the content man with nothing to lose. I let them believe it. I kept living the same way. I went to work, came home, fixed little things around the house, read. I kept my pace steady, showing no sign of what had changed inside, because I understood one thing. The most effective counterstrike comes from the place people aren't looking. As the party date got closer, I felt a strange calm. No nerves, no anxiety. I knew I'd chosen the right stage. I knew I didn't have to do anything more than show up on time with what I'd prepared. And when they walked onto that stage believing everything was already in their hands, they would end up saying it all themselves. I didn't have to expose them. With words, I only had to let them follow their plan. Because that plan, no matter how it was dressed up with pretty words like happiness and fairness, had been built on a single assumption, that I had nothing, and I knew the moment that assumption collapsed, everything would change in a way they couldn't control. I stood up from the living room chair, turned off the light, and walked upstairs. The party ahead no longer weighed on me. It was only a meeting point between what they believed and what I knew, and I was ready to wait for it. In silence, the way I always had. The atmosphere in the hall that night carried the kind of formality I'd known for years working for the city. Rows of tables were draped in white cloth, and soft yellow lighting reflected off the old wooden floor, making the room feel both warm and solemn. The smell of baked goods mixed with hot coffee in the air. People kept their voices low, as if everyone understood this was an occasion that demanded respect. I stood near the entrance, shaking hands, hearing congratulations, listening to the familiar lines about the long road I'd walked. There were faces I hadn't seen in a long time. Former co-workers, men who'd stood beside me through snowstorms, through nights of outages that felt like they'd never end. They looked at me with an honest familiarity, no show, no polish. To them, I was reliable. I was the man who showed up when needed. That softened something in me. For a moment, I let myself believe the night might be nothing more than a simple farewell to work. When my old supervisor stepped up to the podium, the hall went quiet. He held the microphone with both hands, his voice slightly shaky with age. He talked about the years I'd put in, about the times the city needed someone, and I didn't turn away. He told a few small stories only people in the job would understand. There was light laughter, a few nods. I saw someone wipe their eyes. I stood, bowed my head in thanks. For a brief second, I forgot everything else. I was simply a man being recognized for the work he'd done. The applause rose up and lasted longer than I expected. I looked toward the row where my family sat. Evan clapped along with everyone else, his face calm. Natalie clapped too, wearing a polite smile. Linda sat upright, hands on her lap, eyes fixed on the stage like she was waiting for her turn. I couldn't read what she was thinking in that moment, maybe because I didn't want to anymore. Then Linda stood. She walked onto the stage with her usual confidence. She took the microphone, smiled at the room, and began with words that sounded perfectly appropriate. She talked about the years I left early and came home late, about the evenings she waited up, about what it meant to have a husband who worked for the city. People nodded, sympathetic. I nodded, too. What she said wasn't wrong. It was the way she said it that made me feel like I was a story that had already been finished. She said, this night wasn't only a retirement party, it was a milestone. She talked about how everyone deserved a new chapter in life. The way she emphasized new chapter caught my attention. I heard a few faint murmurs, but most people still believed it was simply a tribute, phrased a little differently. Linda paused, then pulled a thick envelope from her purse. She held it with both hands and turned to look at me. That moment stretched, longer than it should have. I heard someone clear their throat behind me. She said my name clearly without trembling. She said that after many years she believed it was time for us to be honest with each other, and then she held the envelope out to me. These are divorce papers, she said loud enough for the whole room to hear. A heavy silence dropped like something thrown to the floor. I heard chairs shift, quick breaths, whispers people couldn't swallow in time. I took the envelope. My hands didn't shake. I opened it, flipped through a few pages, saw my name, saw the dry legal language. I nodded, like I'd been told this ahead of time. Before I could say anything, Evan stood. He looked at the room, then at me. His voice carried firmer than I expected. He said he and Natalie already knew. He said they supported their mother's decision. He said the most important thing was happiness. Natalie stood too, nodded and said, sometimes adults had to be brave enough to do what was right for themselves. Those words didn't surprise me. I'd heard them before, just in smaller rooms, in quieter conversations. But hearing them echo through that hall in front of people who came to celebrate me still felt different, colder, more public. And then that sentence was said, not by Linda, but by Evan. He said maybe this was the best thing that could happen. He said everything was finally going back where it belonged. He spoke as if I were a piece that needed to be removed so the rest could be arranged properly. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it cut deeper than any accusation in that moment. I understood there was nothing left to protect. Not because I was furious, but because everything had been said too plainly. I stood. My chair scraped softly against the wood floor. The sound was small, but enough to make heads turn. I stepped forward and stood beside Linda. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, then up at the room. I didn't rush to speak. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds. I looked at the faces, waiting for my reaction. I saw curiosity, discomfort, and even a hint of anticipation. Maybe they expected me to explode. Maybe they expected me to collapse. I didn't neither. I said I understood. I said I respected honesty. My voice stayed steady. Not high, not low. I said if this was what everyone had decided, I wouldn't stand in the way. I folded the papers and set them on the nearest table. People exhaled like a storm had passed. But I wasn't done. I looked at Evan, then Natalie, then Linda. I said, if we'd chosen to say everything in front of each other, then maybe I should be honest, too. I said I'd spent years listening, watching, staying quiet. And I said, silence didn't mean I had nothing to say. The room went still again. I felt the air shift like the wind changing direction. I took a slow breath. I knew there was no going back from this moment. But I also knew I wasn't standing there to get revenge. I was standing there to put the truth where it belonged. I looked into Linda's eyes one last time as her husband. Then I turned to face the room, to face the people who had come for me. I said there were things they didn't know, not because I'd hidden them to deceive anyone, but because no one had ever asked. I said tonight might be the right time to speak. Not to humiliate anyone, but to make it clear this story wasn't as simple as an envelope handed over at a retirement party. I stopped there. I didn't give details yet. I only opened the first door, but I could already see the confusion on the faces of people who had been far too confident. I knew I'd chosen the right stage. And as I stood there under the hall's warm yellow lights, I understood that from this moment on, the truth wouldn't stay in the dark. I stayed there for a few more seconds, letting silence do its job. I'd learned that sometimes you don't need to speak right away. Waiting makes people reveal more than any question ever could. Linda looked at me, her expression shifting between confusion and caution. Evan frowned. Natalie tightened her grip on her purse strap. They didn't know what I was about to say, but I could see they weren't as sure of themselves as they'd been minutes earlier. I began with what they believed I would never dare to mention. I said that before we talked about papers, about assets, about what would be divided. There was something that needed to be said because it was the real reason for this night. I said that over the past 8 months, Linda had been involved with someone else. I didn't say it like an accusation. I said it like reporting something already confirmed. I said his name. I mentioned the late workouts that stretched on. I mentioned the repeating charges. I said enough that I didn't need to say more. The only sound in the room was someone drawing a sharp breath. Linda froze, lips pressed tight. She started to speak, then stopped. Evan turned to his mother as if waiting for her to deny it. Natalie stared at the floor, unable to look at me. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to prove anything. Truth has a way of standing on its own. I said I wasn't bringing it up to shame anyone. I was bringing it up because it explained why this was happening here, why the papers were handed to me on a night that was supposed to honor me. I said that if we were choosing honesty, then it should be complete. Then I moved to the thing they believed they already understood. I set my leather briefcase on the table, unlatched it, and pulled out the file I'd placed there earlier. I didn't hold it up high. I didn't pass it around. I simply opened it, letting the room see the first pages. I said this was the list of what I owned. Not plans, not dreams, what already existed. I read a few numbers, not many, just enough. I talked about rental houses. I talked about monthly cash flow. I talked about current value based on recent appraisals. I spoke slowly so no one could misunderstand. I didn't use big words. I didn't embellish. I just stated the truth as it was. Oh, the room went dead silent. Not the polite kind of silence, but the kind that comes when something collapses inside people's minds. I saw it on Evan's face. Calculations being forced to restart from scratch. I saw it in Natalie, a clear fear surfacing, no longer hidden behind practiced confidence. I saw it in Linda, a sudden emptiness, as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Numbers did what words couldn't. They didn't persuade. They simply existed. And because they existed, they forced everyone to adjust how they saw me. I didn't need to say my passive income had exceeded my city paycheck long ago. I only said it was enough for me to retire without worry. I didn't need to emphasize everything was in my name. I only said I'd prepared for my future in the way I knew how. There were whispers, small, quick. Someone murmured my name. Someone else looked at the person beside them like they needed confirmation they'd heard right. I saw a few former coworkers, frowned, not in doubt, but in shock. They'd never imagined I was that kind of man. And oddly, that made me feel lighter. I hadn't built any of this to be seen. I'd built it to exist. My family began to unravel in real time. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. Natalie took a step forward, then stopped. Linda stood still, arms hanging at her sides. I knew they were trying to rebuild the whole story. The money I'd given them, the documents I'd signed without asking, the nights I came home late. Suddenly, everything carried a different meaning. I explained only briefly. I said, I never brought it up, because no one ever asked. I said I didn't show off because I didn't need to. I said I did it all quietly because silence gave me space. I said every property had been bought with the extra money I earned over the years. I'd been labeled content, and I left it there. I didn't talk strategy. I didn't talk risk. I didn't talk about exhaustion. I didn't need to list my sacrifices. I simply set the truth on the table where it belonged. Anyone who wanted to understand would ask. Anyone who didn't want to couldn't deny it anyway. The air in the hall changed completely. Their earlier confidence dissolved into something fragile. Linda spoke softly, almost a whisper, asking why I never told her. I said I had told her in the only way I knew, through action. Evan asked if those numbers were real. I nodded. Natalie asked if everything could be discussed again. I looked at her, and for the first time that night, I saw fear in her eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't mock them. I only stood there watching the price of underestimating someone come into view. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because he needed to see the consequences of the assumptions they'd been living on. They had believed I had nothing. They had built their plan on that. And now that foundation had cracked. I said I wasn't changing any decisions tonight. I said the papers were still there. I said we would do everything through the proper legal process in the right order. I didn't threaten. I didn't issue an ultimatum. I only said everything would have to be seen again with all the facts on the table. When I finished, no one clapped. No one laughed. No one knew what to do next. And in that moment I understood I had taken back what mattered most. The right to be seen accurately, not as the content man they'd grown used to dismissing, but as someone who had chosen silence to build. I closed my briefcase and set it beside the table. I looked around the hall at the people who had come for me. I could see it in their eyes. No pity anymore. Respect, confusion, and even a trace of admiration they didn't yet know how to name. I turned to my family and said I was stepping out for a moment so they could have space. I didn't need to stay and watch their assumptions collapse. I'd said enough. As I walked out from under the warm yellow lights, the cool night air hit my face. I took a deep breath, not out of relief, but because I knew I had finally paid a debt. That had stretched for years, the debt I owed myself for staying silent too long. And when the door closed behind me, I understood the price of underestimating someone had been paid. Not with shouting, but with truth, spoken at the right time, in the right place. What happened after that night wasn't dramatic, the way it had been on that stage. It was slow, cold, and precise. Just the way the law moves when emotion is pushed aside. I didn't have to do much. Once truth is placed where it belongs, it carries itself the rest of the way forward. My lawyer called me the next morning. Her voice was calm, not surprised at all. She said the situation had completely changed. Not because of what I said in front of the crowd, but because of what I had prepared over many years. My financial records were clear, separate, and time-stamped. Every investment was in my own name, built from my personal income, not mixed with family funds. That made the divorce far simpler, at least from a legal standpoint. Linda realized that quickly. The initial demands in her divorce filing were revised. There were no more large figures, no more vague assumptions. She could only ask for what she had known about, the house we were living in, the joint account she had managed, and a few other minor things. Everything else, the things she had never asked about, never paid attention to, never believed existed, was beyond her reach. I didn't feel happy when I heard that. I just felt closure. Not because I won, but because everything was finally called by its proper name. Linda wasn't deprived of anything. She simply received exactly the part she had chosen to see over the years. No more, no less. The man she had trusted disappeared faster than I expected. When the numbers came up, when the truth about the assets was no longer casual talk, but signed, stamped documents, the appeal of that relationship changed. I heard through others that he didn't want to be involved in a complicated divorce, especially when the benefits were no longer what he had imagined. Linda didn't tell me about it. She didn't need to. His absence was answer enough. Her reputation, the thing she had cared for more than the marriage, collapsed quietly, but completely. People who had once listened to her complain about a content husband began to ask questions. Old stories were revisited under new light. No one openly criticized her, but invitations became less frequent. Calls slowed down. Looks changed. Sometimes social silence weighs heavier than any judgment. Evan and Natalie began to panic when they realized what they had taken for granted was no longer certain. The money they had already planned to use suddenly became numbers with no owner. Plans built on a faulty foundation started to shake. Evan called me more often. Natalie sent longer messages. Their voices were no longer firm. They trembled, mixed with worry. The apologies came late. Evan said he hadn't understood. Natalie said she had been swept along. They talked about family, about the past, about how everyone can make mistakes. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod right away either. I let them say everything because I knew that sometimes speaking is part of awakening. But apologies don't automatically erase consequences. I told them that, calmly, without blame. I said I was still their father. That wouldn't change. But relationships between adults need boundaries. I said I would no longer be a lifeline for decisions they refused to take responsibility for. I said, if they needed advice, I was willing. If they needed time, I could wait. But if they needed money, simply because they believed I had it, then the answer would be no. That wasn't revenge. Revenge requires strong emotion. What I did was simply stop. Stop compensating for disrespect. Stop rescuing people who didn't want to learn how to stand on their own. I didn't slam the door shut. I just stopped holding it open the way I used to. Some evenings I sat alone in a house that was now much quieter. I thought about the years that had passed, not with regret, but with clarity. I realized the most painful thing wasn't losing a marriage, but realizing it had ended long before any papers were signed. Everything after that was just procedure. The law doesn't stand with anyone because of feelings. It stands with financial truth, with what can be proven. And for the first time in many years, that felt fair to me. Not fairness as punishment, but fairness as each person receiving exactly the result of the choices they made. Linda stopped calling. Evan and Natalie still reached out occasionally, more carefully, more hesitantly. I responded within limits. I didn't lecture them. I didn't revisit what had happened. I let life do its work, because some lessons, if not learned through experience, never take root. I didn't see myself as a winner. I only saw myself as someone who had finally stopped losing to himself. Divorce, I learned, is not for those who misjudge. Not because they're punished, but because they have to face the reality they ignored. And in that reality, there is no room for convenient assumptions. I moved forward, neither fast nor slow. I carried no resentment, only the clarity I should have had long ago. And this time I was no longer silent, at least not with myself. The months that followed passed slowly, without climaxes, without the dramatic conversations people often imagine after a major collapse. Everything unfolded quietly, like a person relearning how to stand once a familiar crutch has been taken away. I didn't closely follow my children's lives, but I heard enough to understand that for the first time in their lives, they were truly touching reality. Evan changed first, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. The support he once believed was guaranteed was gone. Plans for more schooling, higher degrees, and investing in the future suddenly felt like luxuries when bills still arrived every month. In the end, he took a manual labor job that he probably never would have considered before. Not because the job was beneath him, but because in his mind there had once been an invisible hierarchy, one where people like me always stood on the lower level. I wasn't there when Evan started that job, but I could picture it. Early mornings, coming home with a sore back and aching hands, simple dinners, no longer filled with talk of opportunities or strategies. Just exhaustion and silence. For the first time he understood that labor isn't an abstract idea. It's time, strength, and the price paid for every dollar earned. Once Evan called me, not to ask for money, just to say he had been working for 3 weeks. His voice was different, slower, less defensive. He said the work wasn't easy, that some people there had been doing it for decades. He said they knew how to work, how to endure, how to survive. I listened without commenting. I didn't say, I've been there. He understood on his own, and that mattered more than any reminder. Natalie chose a different path, but it was no less difficult. When familiar resources disappeared, she was forced to look at herself again. Social connections that once made her feel secure weren't enough to rebuild a foundation. She had to start over in the most literal sense. Find work, learn to manage every expense, accept small failures she had never experienced before. Natalie didn't call me often. She had always been more independent than Evan, but she was also used to having a safety net. When that net vanished, she wobbled, but little by little she learned to stand upright. I heard through acquaintances that she took on extra work, that she managed on her own. It wasn't always smooth, Some weeks were very hard, but it was during those weeks that she began to understand the value of every hour worked. Respect didn't come immediately. It wasn't a decision made in a single evening. It came slowly through uncomfortable experiences. Evan began asking me about the years I worked. Natalie began listening instead of reacting. Their questions were no longer formalities. They carried weight because now they had context to understand the answers. I watched from a distance. I didn't step in to guide them. I didn't offer advice unless asked. Not because I was cold, but because I knew intervening now would only slow their growth. Some lessons lose their power when solved, and it had taken me many years to learn that. At times I wondered if I was being too harsh. Then I remembered how it felt to be underestimated, to have my value reduced day by day, and I understood that my earlier leniency had helped create the problem. Not because I gave, but because I gave without boundaries. Now those boundaries existed not to punish, but to protect all of us from repeating the same mistakes. My children's growth didn't come from lectures, but from lack. When there was no easy escape, they were forced to discover their real abilities. Evan began to respect the people he worked alongside. Natalie learned patience with herself. Those things can't be bought with money, and they can't be taught with words. Our family is no longer what it once was. Gatherings aren't as full. They no longer feel complete in the old sense, but they're more real. When Evan visits, he doesn't talk much. He helps me fix things around the house. When Natalie stops by, she sits, drinks coffee, and asks me about the books I'm reading. There are no conversations about money, no unspoken assumptions, just presence. I won't say every crack is healed. Some silences remain. Some things can't return to how they were. But one thing is clear. Our relationships are no longer built on convenient misunderstandings. They're built on real experience, on respect, reconstructed from a new foundation. This is a lesson none of us wanted, but all of us needed. I learned that silence has value, but silence without boundaries will be exploited. My children learned that labor isn't just a way to earn money, it's a measure of dignity. Our family is no longer a fragile unit held together by assumptions, but individuals learning how to stand beside one another honestly. I continue living my life calmer, clearer. I don't wait for validation. I hold on to one thing only, honesty with myself. And for the first time in a very long while, that is enough. My life after the divorce isn't loud, nor does it resemble the dramatic rebirth people often imagine. It moves slowly, steadily, and solidly in a way I'd never known before. My mornings begin with brewing a cup of coffee and opening the window to let sunlight fill a quiet kitchen. There are no distracted questions, no probing looks, no feeling that I need to explain why I live this way or that way. There's just me, and a rhythm of life I fully control. I moved into a smaller place, not because I had to downsize, but because I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The new home is bright enough, warm enough for me and quiet afternoons spent, reading enough for a few genuine friends to stop by. I've spent more time on things I once set aside. Long morning walks, fixing up rental houses with my own hands, talking with tenants as equals, not out of obligation. The peace I've found doesn't come from everything being over, but from the boundaries I've finally dared to set. I'm no longer afraid of disappointing others by saying no. I no longer feel guilty choosing silence over explanation. I've learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doorframes that let the right relationships in and keep the wrong ones out. Relationships in my life have been filtered naturally. Some people disappeared when I stopped being accommodating. Some calls faded when I was no longer the one solving everyone's problems. But some people stayed not for benefit, not for expectation. They stayed because they respected who I am, not what I can provide. And for me, that's enough. I didn't lose my family. I only lost the illusions I had nurtured for too long. The illusion that unconditional giving would be appreciated. The illusion that endless silence would keep the peace. The illusion that blood ties alone would protect you from being hurt. When those illusions fell away, what remained wasn't emptiness, but clarity. And clarity, though sometimes cold, is always a sturdier foundation than any promise. I look back on the road I've traveled with a calm that surprises even me. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I allowed myself to learn from that hurt. I'm no longer a man who stays silent out of fear of upsetting others. I'm someone who knows when to be quiet and when to speak, not to win, but to protect my own worth. The story you've just heard is a work of fiction, inspired by life situations and human experiences created to offer moral value, life lessons, and emotional resonance for the audience. It does not encourage anyone to imitate the actions in the story, does not incite hatred, and is not directed at any individual or organization. Every person and every real-life situation is different, and your choices should always be made with your own judgment and responsibility. Personally, I believe there are three major values anyone can take from this story. First, silence does not mean weakness. In real life, if you are being underestimated or looked down on, don't rush to argue or prove yourself. Observe, take note, and prepare, because information and initiative are always the greatest advantages. Second, respect doesn't come from titles or blood ties. It comes from clear boundaries. If you give endlessly without limits, others will see your sacrifice as obligation, not value. And third, be transparent and strategic with your personal finances. Not to show off, but to protect yourself. Many people are deeply hurt simply because they weren't prepared for the day everything changed. If in real life you find yourself in a similar situation, being underestimated by family, loved ones, or people around you, this is my sincere advice to you. Don't confront when you're not ready. Don't explain yourself to those who don't want to understand. And don't let others decide the value of your life for you. Your value isn't measured by how much you give, but by how clearly you understand who you are and how you deserve to be treated. Before this story comes to a close, I want to leave you with a few words. You who stayed until the very end. If you see yourself in this story, remember that you are not alone. There are many people out there quietly enduring and learning how to stand on their own, just as I once did. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, or briefly share your own story. Not to judge, just to be heard. And if this story gave you a moment of reflection or a feeling of being understood, a like or a subscription is the simplest way to support the stories to come. Thank you for listening. Wherever you are in life, I hope you move forward with more clarity, stronger boundaries, and greater peace. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to stop staying silent. Subscribe to Astral Vengeance. Thank you, family.